Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable, food, or more specifically junk food, because as it turns out the medieval world had its own guilty pleasures, from greasy fairground snacks to the kind of street food that probably shorten your life expectancy in ways we can only imagine. But that's just the beginning. We'll also wander into the realm of ancient dream interpretation, where kings hired specialists to decode the messages of the night. We'll saddle up with the Pony Express and its riders racing across the American frontier, and we'll raise a mug of some of the oldest beer in history, brewed not with modern precision, but with a mix of luck, prayer, and wild yeast. So before we start nibbling on centuries-old snacks, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments what your go-to comfort food is these days. It's always fun to compare taste. Across time and place, now dim the lights, maybe keep a drink nearby, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you imagine the Middle Ages, you probably think of banquets. Long wooden tables groaning with roasted boar, whole peacocks with their feathers reattached for dramatic flair, golden goblets filled with spiced wine. But the truth is that most medieval people were not feasting like kings. They were trying to get through the day without starving, and sometimes, just sometimes, they craved something unnecessary, something purely for taste and pleasure, something we might call junk food. Now, medieval junk food didn't come in plastic wrappers with neon logos, but it was no less indulgent. The streets of medieval cities were lined with vendors selling piping hot treats, greasy fingers guaranteed. Think of it as the medieval version of a food truck festival, but instead of tacos and craft burgers, you might find meat pies, deep-fried fritters, and questionable sausages that you probably shouldn't ask too many questions about. One of the most common snacks was the humble pie. Not the sweet apple variety we imagine for dessert, but savory pies filled with chopped meat, onions, herbs, and sometimes whatever leftovers were available. Street cooks would bake them en masse and sell them hot to passers-by. For a few pennies, a hungry worker could grab one and eat it with his hands. No fork or knife required. Picture London's bustling markets, the smell of roasting meat, the cries of vendors, and people tearing into flaky, steaming pies while navigating muddy streets. The medieval pie was quick, filling, and portable, everything a good snack needs to be. But pies weren't the only thing on offer. The medieval sweet tooth was alive and well, even without refined sugar as we know it. Honey was the sweetener of choice, and cooks used it liberally in fritters, little balls of dough fried in hot oil and then drizzled with honey. Imagine the stickiness, the crunch, and the sugar rush hitting at the same time. It's easy to picture children with sticky hands, licking their fingers clean while their parents pretended not to notice. And yes, the honey sometimes attracted flies, but food hygiene wasn't exactly a medieval priority. Fairs and festivals were the prime spots for indulging. Much like our modern carnivals with funnel cakes and candy apples, medieval festivals had their signature treats. Roasted nuts, candied fruits, and even gingerbread made appearance. Gingerbread was particularly popular in later centuries. Not the soft, chewy cookie we know, but a dense, spiced cake pressed into molds shaped like animals, saints, or even kings. It was both edible and decorative, a snack and a souvenir rolled into one. Now, let's not forget the medieval love of fried things. Fritters could be savory too, thin slices of cheese or vegetables dunked in batter and fried until crisp. Cheese fritters were especially beloved, often seasoned with herbs and spices. Imagine a medieval fairground with the smell of hot oil and melted cheese drifting through the air, essentially the ancestor of mozzarella sticks. The only difference was that refrigeration didn't exist, so the cheese might have been a bit more adventurous in flavor. Of course, no discussion of medieval junk food would be complete without mentioning alcohol. Beer and ale were the soda of the Middle Ages, consumed daily by nearly everyone, including children. But for special occasions, there were sweetened and spiced versions, warm drinks infused with cinnamon, ginger, or cloves, served at festivals or taverns. It was less about quenching thirst and more about enjoying the buzz. You might call it the medieval energy drink, a pick-me-up with a kick. But as with all junk food, quality was not guaranteed. Street food vendors didn't have to pass health inspection. The meat in your pie might be several days past its prime. The oil used for frying might have been reused far too many times. And yet, people kept buying because cheap, tasty food is irresistible in every century. Chroniclers from the time occasionally mention outbreaks of food poisoning, usually blamed on bad fish or corrupt pies. But no matter how many stomachs turned, the vendors kept frying, baking, and selling. The demand was too high. Interestingly, medieval authorities often tried to regulate street food. In London, for example, Bakers could be fined if their pies were found to be underweight or made with spoiled meat. Public officials were surprisingly strict about bread, the cornerstone of medieval diets, but more lenient when it came to pies and fritters. After all, junk food has always lived in a gray area, technically unnecessary, but too beloved to ban outright. There's also a social element to consider. Eating junk food in the Middle Ages was often a communal experience. Workers would crowd around a street vendor's stall, chatting as they waited for their pies. Families at fairs would share fritters and candied nuts, passing them around as they watched jugglers or listened to musicians. Junk food wasn't just about eating, it was about being part of the crowd, joining in the celebration. And let's be honest, it was fun. Even in an age defined by hard labor, disease, and short lifespans, people wanted their little luxuries. A hot pie, a sticky honey fritter, a spiced drink. It was comfort food in its purest form, something unnecessary but utterly human. So the next time you unwrap a candy bar or grab fries from a drive-thru, think of your medieval counterparts, standing in a muddy street with a pie in one hand and a mug of ale in the other. Different snacks, same guilty pleasure. Dreams, we all have them. Some are comforting, like floating through clouds or finding a door to a secret garden. Others are less enjoyable, like showing up to work without pants or being chased by something large, fanged, and very determined. In the modern world, we tend to treat dreams as random firings of the brain, occasionally amusing, occasionally terrifying, and usually forgotten by breakfast. But for much of human history, dreams were not dismissed so casually. They were messages, portals, warnings, clues from gods, spirits, or the universe itself. And entire cultures built elaborate systems to interpret them. Let's start at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as history allowed. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 5,000 years ago, dreams were considered direct communications from the gods. The Sumerians and Babylonians didn't just wake up, shrug, and move on. They recorded their dreams on clay tablets, carefully cataloged and analyzed. If you dreamed of water, it might mean prosperity. If you dreamed of being eaten by a lion, it probably wasn't a good sign for your week ahead. There were even professional dream interpreters who could be consulted, a kind of spiritual customer service desk for your subconscious. The Egyptians took it one step further. They believed dreams could reveal the will of the gods, and priests acted as interpreters. They even had dream books filled with long lists of symbols and their meanings. Dream of a cat? That might mean good luck. Dream of being bitten by a crocodile? Bad news unless you happen to be a crocodile god's favorite priest. The Egyptians also practiced dream incubation, sleeping in temples to encourage divine dreams. Imagine lying on a stone floor, surrounded by incense smoke, hoping your dreams would deliver you a sacred message instead of just replaying yesterday's awkward conversation. The Greeks and Romans, never ones to pass up a chance to intellectualize something, developed their own dream theory. Aristotle suggested that dreams were connected to bodily health, sort of like an early version of psychosomatic medicine. Others thought dreams were omens. And then there was Artemidorus of Daldis, a Greek dream interpreter in the 2nd century CE, who wrote a 5-volume manual called the Oneirocritica. This was essentially the ancient world's definitive dream dictionary. Artemidorus was painstaking in his detail, insisting that context mattered. For example, dreaming of losing teeth could mean different things depending on whether you were young, old, rich, poor, or somewhere in between. To him, dreams weren't one-size-fits-all. They were deeply personal. But not all dream analysis was so lofty. Some ancient dream interpreters were charlatans, selling their services to desperate clients. Dream books were sometimes sold in marketplaces with ready-made interpretations for a few coins. Much like modern horoscopes, they offered vague advice that could be applied to almost anyone. Dream of flying? Expect success. Dream of falling? Trouble ahead. The human appetite for easy answers hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. In the Middle Ages, dreams continued to hold a powerful grip on the imagination. Christianity complicated matters because while some church thinkers believed dreams could be divine messages, others warned that they could come from the devil, meant to tempt or deceive. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential early Christian writers, admitted that dreams sometimes troubled him, especially the ones that reminded him of sins he thought he had left behind. By the 12th century, theologians were debating whether dreams were natural processes, spiritual visions, or demonic tricks. Imagine trying to explain to your confessor that your dream about eating too much cheese was actually a cosmic struggle for your soul. But ordinary people, of course, kept dreaming. Medieval dream books circulated widely, especially in the later Middle Ages. They often tied dream imagery to events in everyday life. Dream of losing a shoe? Expect trouble in marriage. Dream of finding coins? Financial luck is on the way. These collections were copied, translated, and handed down. A kind of folk wisdom that blended pagan, classical, and Christian ideas into one sprawling symbolic system. Dreams also appeared in medieval literature, sometimes as framing devices. Chaucer's Book of the Duchess begins with a narrator who falls asleep and dreams of a black-clad knight mourning his lost love. The dream allows Chaucer to explore grief, love, and poetry all at once. Dante's Divine Comedy is filled with dreamlike visions, blurring the line between sleep and spiritual journey. For medieval writers, dreams were a narrative playground, a way to speak about things too strange or too dangerous to confront directly. And then there's the practical side. Some people believe dreams could predict illness. If you dreamed of fire, perhaps you were running a fever. If you dreamed of floods, maybe your body was retaining fluids. Doctors of the time occasionally used dreams as diagnostic tools, a practice that sounds quaint now but was deadly serious then. When medical knowledge was limited, a vivid dream seemed as good a clue as any. What's striking is how universal the urge to interpret dreams has been. From Mesopotamian clay tablets to medieval manuscripts, people across centuries and continents clung to the idea that dreams meant something, that the random, surreal images of the night were not random at all, but coded messages waiting to be deciphered. It speaks to a very human desire, the wish to believe that our lives are part of a larger story, that the strange visions we see in sleep are chapters written by hands greater than ours. And even now, we haven't completely let go of that instinct. Dream dictionaries still exist, sold in bookstores and online. People still search the internet for dream of teeth falling out meaning. Psychologists from Freud to Jung built entire theories around dream interpretation. We may laugh at the superstitions of the past, but we're not as far removed from them as we like to think. So, the next time you wake up from a strange dream, resist the urge to dismiss it immediately. You might not believe it's a message from the gods, but know that for most of human history, that's exactly what people thought it was. Whether it was a Sumerian priest, an Egyptian dream incubator, or a medieval scribe copying a dream book by candlelight, countless others before you stared at the ceiling in the morning and wondered, what did that mean? If there is one image that captures the restless spirit of 19th century America, it's a lone rider galloping across a vast plain, leather mailbags slung over the saddle, chasing the horizon as if the world itself depended on him getting there in time. The Pony Express has become legend, one of those slices of history that seems bigger than life, the kind of thing you half expect to be a myth. But it was very real, if very brief. The Pony Express officially ran from April 1860 to October 1861, a mere 18 months. That's it. A year and a half, barely long enough to graduate high school. Yet, in that short time, it managed to brand itself on the American imagination forever. Why? Because it represented speed, daring, and a kind of frontier heroism that later generations loved to romanticize. The basic idea was simple: carry mail faster than anyone thought possible. Before the Pony Express, letters from Missouri to California could take weeks, sometimes months, to arrive. Steamships around South America were slow. Stagecoaches were unreliable. The nation was expanding westward at breakneck speed, and communications simply couldn't keep up. Enter the Pony Express. It was the brainchild of three men: William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell, freight operators who saw a business opportunity. They proposed a relay system of riders and horses stretching nearly 2,000 miles between St. Joseph, Missouri, and Sacramento, California. Along the route, roughly every 10 to 15 miles, they built relay station. At each one, a fresh horse would be waiting. The rider would leap off, toss the mail pouch, called a mochila, onto a new mount and ride on without pausing for breath. This leapfrog method cut delivery time dramatically. Letters could cross the continent in about 10 days. 10 days. In an era when fast usually meant weeks, that was revolutionary. But speed came at a price, and the price was danger. Riders faced everything the frontier could throw at them: wild storms, flooded rivers, scorching deserts, snow-choked mountain passes. There were accidents, horses stumbling at full gallop, riders thrown and injured miles from help. There were threats from bandits and sometimes conflicts with Native American groups whose lands the riders trespassed across. And always there was exhaustion. Imagine riding 75 to 100 miles in a single shift, changing horses every hour or two, barely stopping to eat or sleep. The Pony Express rider was part athlete, part stuntman, part daredevil. They were young, too. Most riders were teenagers. The company advertised for young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. Sounds like dark humor, but it was a real advertisement. Orphans, after all, had fewer people to mourn them if things went wrong. Some famous names passed through the Pony Express. Buffalo Bill Cody later claimed he had been a rider, though his stories tended to stretch the truth. Still, there's no doubt the riders were extraordinary. Brave, reckless, maybe a little bit crazy. The horses, too, were heroes in their own right. Small, hardy Mustangs and thoroughbreds carried the riders over impossible terrain, sometimes pushed to the edge of their endurance. At full gallop, they would pound along dusty trails, ears flat, foam flecking their coats. Each horse's shift was short, 10 miles, maybe 15, but in that stretch they gave everything. The partnership between rider and horse was absolute, one trusting the other with life itself. What's striking is how slim the cargo actually was. The mochila, the specially designed mail pouch, weighed about 20 pounds when full. That was it. No passengers, no freight, just letters. The whole system existed for the sake of communication. For parents writing to children who had gone west, for businesses keeping contracts alive, for a government trying to hold together a nation that stretched thousands of miles. Words mattered that much. And yet, for all its romance, the Pony Express was never a financial success. It was expensive to maintain the stations, pay the riders, and replace horses. The company lost money almost from the beginning, and just as it was finding its rhythm, technology overtook it. In October 1861, the transcontinental telegraph line was completed. Suddenly, messages that had taken 10 days on horseback could be sent in minutes. The Pony Express was obsolete overnight. It shut down 2 days after the telegraph went live, but the brevity of its existence only added to its legend. Newspapers of the time hailed the speed and bravery of the riders. Later dime novels turned them into larger-than-life characters, frontier superheroes who raced through danger with the fate of the nation in their saddlebag. Hollywood, of course, loved the story. Films and TV shows added drama, polishing away the mud, blood, and exhaustion to leave only the gleam of heroism. Strip away the myth, though, and what you have is something deeply human, the desperate urge to connect across distance. Parents writing to children, lovers writing to one another, merchants making deals, governments trying to govern, all relying on a boy on a horse racing through wind and storm. That's why the Pony Express still lingers in our imagination. It was fast food for the heart, costly, unsustainable, but irresistible while it lasted. Today, the old trail has become part of heritage tourism. Some of the relay stations are preserved, weathered wooden outposts where you can almost hear the thunder of hooves. Each year, riders reenact the Pony Express in a commemorative relay, carrying mail the old-fashioned way, passing the mochila from saddle to saddle across the plains. It's slower than FedEx, far slower than email, but it's a reminder that once upon a time, communication required grit, endurance, and a little madness. And maybe that's the real appeal. The Pony Express wasn't practical. It wasn't profitable, but it was bold. It was a gamble that briefly worked, a bridge between an old world of stagecoaches and a new world of wires and machines. For a year and a half, the fastest thing on the American frontier was not steam, not electricity, but muscle. A horse stretched to the limit, a rider bent low over the saddle, carrying words across a continent. So the next time your email takes more than 5 seconds to send and you feel like complaining, think of those boys in the saddle, rattling across endless prairies with 20 pounds of letters strapped to their back. 10 days if all went well, weeks if it didn't. Communication has always been a race against distance and time. The Pony Express was just one lap in that endless race, short, dangerous, glorious, and unforgettable. If bread is the staff of life, beer has always been its slightly rowdier cousin. Humanity discovered fermentation long before it discovered modern hygiene, and for thousands of years, beer has been less a beverage than a survival strategy, a social glue, and, in many cases, a safer alternative to water. It is easy to imagine that beer was simply an accident, some grain porridge left in a pot, rainwater seeping in, wild yeast floating through the air. Someone, braver or hungrier than most, tasted the bubbling mess and found it not terrible. In fact, strangely uplifting. That was all it took. From then on, people didn't just make beer. They lived by it. The Sumerians, around 4000 BCE, were among the first to leave behind written evidence of beer brewing. They worshipped Ninkasi, a goddess of beer, and even left hymns praising her, which doubled as recipes. Imagine religion, music, and cooking instructions rolled into one. The beer itself would not resemble the crisp lagers we know today. It was thick, more like a soupy porridge, cloudy with floating bits of grain. People drank it communally through long reed straws from a shared pot, partly to avoid swallowing the sludge. If the idea of sipping chunky oatmeal beer with your neighbors makes you shudder, remember, this was cutting-edge technology at the time. It was liquid bread, calories you could drink. In ancient Egypt, beer was everywhere. Workers who built the pyramids were paid partly in beer ration. Not glamorous golden goblets, but hearty jugs of yeasty brew that kept bellies full and spirits high. Beer was nourishment, hydration, and morale boost all in one. Archaeologists have even found remains of ancient breweries near worker villages. Industrial-scale operations with vats, clay jars, and residue that still smells faintly malty after millennia. The beer itself was sweet, flavored with dates or honey, sometimes spiced with herbs. It was sustenance for the living and an offering for the dead, buried in tombs so the departed could keep drinking in the afterlife. In Egypt, beer was not a luxury. It was the daily bread of the people. Travel north, and the Celts and Germans were brewing their own versions, often experimenting with whatever grew nearby. Hops, that sharp, bitter plant that defines modern beer, wasn't widely used until the Middle Ages. Instead, early beers might be flavored with heather, bog myrtle, or juniper. Each region had its quirks, its flavors. Beer was a kind of liquid fingerprint of the land. Whatever grew in the soil ended up in the pot. Brewing was usually the domain of women in these early centuries. Known as alewives, they kept the knowledge of fermentation alive, passing it from mother to daughter. Brewing was household work, like baking or spinning, but it was also commerce. Women sold surplus ale in their communities, sometimes marking their homes with a broomstick above the door, an early version of a tavern sign. Some historians even suggest that the image of the alewife in tall hats with broomsticks may have fed into later witch stereotype. Whether or not that's true, it's easy to see how brewing, with its bubbling cauldrons, mysterious herbs, and intoxicating results, could look a little magical. By the Middle Ages, beer and ale had become essential in Europe. Water was often contaminated, carrying diseases that invisible microbes spread freely. People didn't know about germs, but they knew that beer seemed safer. Boiling the water, fermenting the grains, adding herbs, all of this unintentionally killed harmful bacteria. Children drank small beer, a weak, low-alcohol version that provided hydration without the hangover. Adults drank stronger version, often with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The average medieval person likely consumed more beer than modern drinkers, though at a lower alcohol content. A frothy pint was simply part of daily life. Monasteries became centers of brewing innovation. Monks, with their libraries and patient attention to detail, refined recipes, standardized processes, and introduced a level of quality control that home brewing lacked. They kept records, experimented with ingredients, and in some places began adding hops for preservation and flavor. A medieval monastery brewery might have produced hundreds of gallons a week, not just for the monks but for pilgrims, travelers, and the surrounding community. Beer was both charity and commerce, a holy beverage and a very practical one. Some of the world's oldest brewing traditions trace their lineage back to these cloisters, where prayer and fermentation mingled under vaulted stone ceilings. Beer was not just food and drink, it was culture. Drinking together was a ritual, a way to bond, to celebrate, to mourn. Toasts were made, songs were sung, deals were struck over frothy mugs. In Norse sagas, mead halls echo with laughter and boasts, the clinking of horns a soundtrack to epic tales. In medieval towns, alehouses became gathering spots for gossip, games, and arguments that sometimes escalated into brawls. The drink may have been simple, but the social fabric woven around it was rich. Of course, not everyone was enthusiastic. Authorities worried about drunkenness, as they always have. Laws regulated the strength and price of ale. Some rulers even tried to ban women from brewing professionally, handing the trade over to men. But beer was unstoppable. It filled too many bellies, quenched too many thirsts, oiled too many conversations. Attempts to regulate it were like trying to hold back a river with bare hands. The science of brewing would only come much later, when microscopes revealed yeast as the invisible engine behind fermentation. To ancient brewers, the process was half skill, half mystery. You prepared the mash, you let it sit, you hoped for the best. Sometimes the batch soured, sometimes it bubbled perfectly. Success was part recipe, part luck, part superstition. Prayers to gods and saints were common, as if divine approval might tip the balance in your favor. When a good brew was achieved, it wasn't just satisfaction, it was relief. So what did ancient beer taste like? We can only guess. Experiments by archaeologists and craft brewers suggest it was sweeter, thicker, and less carbonated than modern lager. More like malty soup than sparkling pilsner. A drink you chewed as much as swallowed. Yet for those who drank it, it was life itself. If we trace human history not through wars or kings, but through what people actually consumed day after day, beer would take center stage. It sustained farmers, fed workers, funded monasteries, and gave countless communities something to gather around. It was never just about intoxication. It was about nourishment, ritual, identity. The next time you raise a glass, consider how ancient the gesture is. From Sumerian straws in a communal pot to monks perfecting their batches behind monastery walls, every sip carries echoes of thousands of years of brewing. Beer is more than a beverage. It's a story we've been telling for as long as we've had grain, water, and the willingness to let nature work a little magic. When we think of medieval food, we tend to imagine solemn meals in dimly lit halls, monks chewing brown bread in silence, peasants gnawing on onions while staring gloomily into their porridge. But like us, medieval people enjoyed the unnecessary, the frivolous, the kind of snacks that made no nutritional sense but brightened a dull day. And in their own way, these indulgences were every bit as unhealthy, overpriced, and irresistible as a bag of potato chips today. Take wafers, for instance, not the delicate cookies wrapped in pastel plastic at a modern grocery store, but thin, crisp cakes cooked between two hot iron plates. Wafers were often sold by street vendors at church doors or fairs, hot off the press, fragrant with honey and spices. They weren't meant to fill you up, just to delight you. People would munch them after a sermon or while wandering through a festival. Imagine the medieval equivalent of buying cotton candy after a carnival ride, sticky fingers and all. And then there were pancakes. Yes, pancakes. Medieval cookbooks include recipes for them, though they were usually made thinner than our breakfast stacks, more like crepes. They could be savory, with herbs, or sweet, topped with honey or fruit preserves. At fairs, you might find vendors flipping them over fire pits, stacking them high, selling them to children whose faces quickly became smeared with syrup. In the Middle Ages, Lent required people to give up certain foods like eggs and dairy, so on the eve of Lent, they would often make pancakes to use up their ingredient. That tradition survives today as Shrove Tuesday, better known to us as Pancake Day. The medieval world didn't invent binge eating before a diet, but it perfected it. If you had a few more coins to spend, candied fruit was a popular treat. Oranges, ginger, even bits of root vegetables could be boiled in honey until sticky and jewel-like. These little morsels were luxuries, sweet, chewy, exotic. They might be displayed at banquets to impress guests or sold in town squares for those willing to splurge. Think of them as medieval gummy bears, though with a slightly higher risk of dental disaster. Tooth decay was a real hazard, and nothing said wealthy quite like blackened stumps where teeth should be. Nuts roasted with spices were another favorite. Almonds in particular were everywhere in medieval cooking, soaked, ground, fried, candied. They were considered not just tasty but also slightly medicinal, because medieval diets always blurred the line between food and health. Eating spiced nuts at a fair wasn't just fun. It was good for balancing your humors, or so people told themselves. A convenient excuse for gluttony if ever there was one. And of course, pies never left the menu. We mentioned meat pies earlier, but there were also sweet versions, filled with dried fruits, figs, raisins, and honey. These could be decorated with elaborate crusts, stamped with patterns, or even miniature sculptures. A pie was more than a snack, it was a statement. To walk through a fair with a steaming slice in hand was to say, yes, I have both spare change and no fear of indigestion. For the truly adventurous, there were dishes we might classify as questionable street meat. Sausages were popular but infamous for their mystery content. Regulations tried to keep vendors honest. Laws forbade them from stuffing in spoiled meat or, worse, dog and cat flesh. But with no FDA inspector on the corner, let's just say some sausages were riskier than others. Yet people still lined up for them because hot, greasy, spiced meat on a stick is hard to resist, whether you're in 1390 or 2025. Some fairs offered treats that leaned toward the theatrical. Colored sugar confections shaped into animals or flowers were prized, though sugar itself was rare and expensive in most of Europe until late in the Middle Ages. These little sculptures were less about eating and more about showing off. A wealthy merchant might hand his child a sugar swan at a festival the way a modern parent might buy a giant balloon. More spectacle than substance. Drinks, too, had their place in the medieval junk food lineup. Mulled wine, spiced ale, and hot mead were sold at fairs and in taverns, served steaming in wooden mugs. These drinks were sweetened with honey or sugar, if available, and perfumed with cinnamon, cloves, or ginger. A sip was warming, intoxicating, and slightly decadent. They weren't everyday drinks, they were festival specials like eggnog at Christmas. Children, of course, had their own taste. They loved honey sticks, literally twigs dipped in honey, sticky toys disguised as food. They also enjoyed gingerbread, not soft like our modern cookies but dense and chewy, made from breadcrumbs, honey, and spices pressed into molds. Gingerbread was fun because it came in shapes: saints, animals, mythical creatures. To eat a gingerbread night was to enjoy both a snack and a toy, though the toy dissolved in your mouth. It's easy to forget how much of medieval junk food was tied to religion and the calendar. Feast days, saints' days, and seasonal festivals all brought out the best snacks. Pilgrims traveling to shrines often bought little cakes or wafers as souvenirs, the medieval version of a gas station snack on a road trip. And fasting seasons like Lent produced their own oddities, mock foods like almond butter or fake fish, to satisfy cravings without breaking the rules. When people are told they can't have something, they get creative. Junk food was often born from those loopholes. But beneath all the grease and honey, there's a kind of comfort in recognizing ourselves. The way people flocked to vendors for a warm pie, the way children begged for sweets, the way festival snacks became part of memory and tradition. Junk food isn't about nutrition, it's about pleasure. And medieval people, with their shorter, harsher lives, perhaps needed those little pleasures even more than we do. If you could time travel to a medieval fair, you'd find the atmosphere oddly familiar. Crowds milling about, music playing, smells of frying oil and roasting nuts in the air. The food might not pass modern health codes, but the spirit is the same as a modern street festival. Junk food is timeless. It's the bite you don't need but take anyway, the taste that lingers long after you've finished, the little indulgence that makes the day feel special. So next time you grab a bag of popcorn at the movies or line up for carnival funnel cake, think of the peasants and merchants of centuries past. Somewhere in a muddy field, they were doing the exact same thing, smiling, snacking, and knowing full well they'd regret it later. Dreams are strange enough when they're pleasant. A gentle walk through a meadow, perhaps, or a banquet where all your friends show up, even that odd neighbor who hasn't spoken to you in years. But nightmares? Those are another story. Few things feel more real than being chased, falling endlessly, or finding yourself face to face with something that has no business existing in the waking world. We wake up sweating, heart pounding, sometimes half convinced the shadow in the corner of the room has followed us out of the dream. Now imagine experiencing such a dream in a world without Freud, without brain scans, without even the faintest concept of neurons firing randomly. In ancient and medieval times, nightmares weren't simply the result of a heavy dinner or stress. They were messages, warnings, omens, sometimes even attacks. Nightmares were taken very seriously indeed. In Mesopotamia, for example, clay tablets describe rituals for warding off evil dreams. A bad dream might be interpreted as a sign that demons or malevolent spirits had taken an interest in you. To counter this, priests performed ceremonies, burning incense, reciting prayers, or crafting protective charms. Dreams were not private quirks of the subconscious. They were evidence that invisible powers were meddling with your life. If you dreamed of being strangled, the interpretation wasn't your stress. It was a spirit is literally trying to choke you. The Egyptians, too, recorded nightmares with anxious care. Some dream books offered reassurance, seeing a white cat, good luck, but others read like horror scripts. Dreams of blood, death, or monsters were considered dangerous warnings. A nightmare wasn't just personal bad luck. It could foretell disaster for a whole household or even a kingdom. Pharaohs sometimes summoned priests to interpret troubling visions, and if the news was dire enough, it might influence political or military decisions. A bad dream could reshape history. In Greece, nightmares had their own deity. The Oneiroi, spirits of dreams, were said to fly through the gates of sleep, bringing visions to mortals. Morpheus, the most famous, shaped dreams of human figures. But among his brothers were Phobter, who brought terrifying dreams of animals and monsters, and Phantasos, who conjured landscapes and objects. Nightmares weren't just accidents. They had a postal system of their own, carried by specialized messengers of the god. A particularly vivid bad dream could be seen as an uninvited guest from this otherworldly realm. The Romans inherited much of this thinking and layered it with their own practical streak. They believed in prophetic dreams, especially for leaders. Generals were known to change strategies after ominous dreams, or to seek interpreters before launching a campaign. Suetonius tells us that before the assassination of Julius Caesar, his wife Calpurnia dreamed of his murder, begging him not to go to the Senate that day. He ignored her. We all know how that turned out. Whether the dream was coincidence or memory polished by later storytellers hardly mattered. It became part of the mythology, a nightmare as prophecy ignored. In the Middle Ages, nightmares were even more loaded. The church warned believers that the devil could use dreams to tempt or frighten. Demons, people believed, crept into bedrooms at night to oppress sleepers. This gave rise to the idea of the nightmare, a malicious spirit that sat on your chest while you slept, suffocating you and filling your head with terror. The modern word nightmare carries that legacy. People described waking in the night unable to breathe or move, pinned down by an unseen weight. Today, we call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was an encounter with the devil's agent. Dream magic also played a role in everyday life. People tried to manipulate their dreams, sometimes to gain knowledge, sometimes to contact loved ones, sometimes to ward off the demonic. Herbs like mugwort and valerian were believed to influence dreams, giving clearer visions or keeping nightmares at bay. Dream pillows stuffed with certain plants were thought to guard the sleeper. And then there were charms, inscribed tablets, whispered prayers, or objects placed under the pillow. In some cultures, even the position you slept in mattered. Sleeping on your left side might invite nightmares, while the right side promised calmer dreams. Prophetic dreams had enormous weight. Whole battles were said to be predicted by them. Saints often appeared in the dreams of believers, delivering warnings or comfort. Pilgrims might sleep in a shrine, hoping to dream of the saint and receive guidance. A dream wasn't entertainment, it was revelation. The line between sleeping and waking, mortal and divine, blurred each night. And yet, just like today, not all dreams fit neatly into symbolic boxes. People had embarrassing dreams, too, dreams of romance, desire, foolish behavior. Medieval writers sometimes confessed to being troubled by such visions, unsure if they were sinful or merely human. Theologians debated whether you could be guilty for something you only dreamed of. For many, nightmares of lust were proof that the devil was at work, slipping temptation directly into their mind. Imagine trying to defend yourself in confession. Father, it wasn't me. It was my dream. It's tempting for us, with our modern perspective, to smile at all this. To say, of course they thought nightmares were demons. They didn't know about REM cycles or brain chemistry. But maybe we should be cautious before we laugh. After all, how often do we search online for the meaning of a strange dream? How many people still turn to dream dictionaries or insist a recurring dream must be telling them something? We may no longer believe demons are sitting on our chest, but the feeling of weight, paralysis, terror, that's universal. The interpretation may change, but the experience is timeless. So when you next wake in the middle of the night, heart racing from some absurd nightmare, remember that you are part of an ancient tradition. From Mesopotamian priests to medieval monks, countless people before you sat up in bed, lit a candle, and wondered what on earth their dream was trying to say. Nightmares have always been with us, creeping out of the dark corners of the mind, whispering that maybe, just maybe, sleep is not as safe as we like to believe. The Pony Express has achieved that rare state of American history where fact and myth blur into one restless silhouette on horseback. Say the words and you probably imagine a lean, dust-streaked rider thundering across the plains, leather satchel bouncing at his side, galloping tirelessly into the sunset with a packet of mail that simply must get through. Never mind that the actual Pony Express lasted less than 2 years, or that most of its riders weren't stoic, square-jawed cowboys, but wiry teenagers with questionable judgment and a strong tolerance for hunger. In the popular imagination, the Pony Express is endurance, speed, and a dash of reckless courage, an Instagram-ready slice of frontier grit, if Instagram had existed in 1860. The service was launched in April of that year, designed to carry mail across nearly 2,000 miles from Missouri to California in record time. The nation was on the brink of civil war, the telegraph network wasn't yet complete, and California felt very far away. A fast mail route promised not only profit but also unity, binding the continent together with a relay of hooves, leather, and sheer human stamina. But who exactly signed up for this job? Not your average clerk, that's for sure. Advertisements supposedly read, "Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred." Whether that ad was ever truly printed is debated, but the sentiment is spot on. This was not work for the faint-hearted. Riders were expected to cover 75 to 100 miles at a stretch, changing horses every 10 to 15 miles. Imagine sprinting a marathon, except your shoes are a half-wild Mustang, the road is a trail littered with snakes and bandits, and your water bottle is mostly dust. Most riders were indeed young, some barely into their teens. They were chosen for their lightweight, which meant less burden on the horse and more speed overall. These boys rode through storms, across rivers, over desert flats and mountain passes. Dangers weren't theoretical. Bandits targeted riders for their valuable satchels. Native tribes, whose lands were being cut through without permission, sometimes attacked stations or ambushed along the trail. And then there were the horses themselves. Riding animal after animal, in all conditions, meant constant risk of being thrown, dragged, or trampled. Food and comfort were luxuries left behind. Riders often lived on jerky, beans, or whatever could be stuffed into a pocket. Sleep came in odd bursts, sometimes just a few minutes stolen on a hard bench at a relay station before the next leg began. The mail, not the man, was the priority. The leather satchel, called a mochila, was designed to slip quickly from one saddle to the next, ensuring the cargo was never delayed even if the rider was. It was a system built for efficiency, not kindness, and yet there was a strange sense of glamour attached to it. Riders became local celebrities, admired for their daring. Townsfolk would gather to watch a horse and rider appear on the horizon, cheer as the mochila was swapped, and marvel at the speed of the handoff. The Pony Express embodied the dream of a connected continent, even if the reality smelled more of sweat, horsehair, and blistered skin than of destiny. The dangers sometimes made heroes of the riders. Take William Buffalo Bill Cody, who claimed later, with some embellishment, to have been a Pony Express rider in his youth. Cody would go on to build a career out of that legend, performing before crowds who thrilled at his tales of midnight rides and hair-raising escapes. Whether or not his stories were strictly true hardly mattered. The Pony Express had already entered the realm of folklore, and folklore demands heroes. But for every Cody, there were countless nameless riders who slogged through mud and hunger with little recognition. They were farm boys, immigrants, drifters. Some lasted weeks before quitting, worn down by the grind. Others stayed until the bitter end, when the service was made obsolete almost overnight by the completion of the transcontinental telegraph in October 1861. The telegraph could send a message from Missouri to California in minutes, not days. The Pony Express, for all its daring, could not compete. And so, after only 18 months, the company folded. Investors lost money, riders went home, stations were abandoned. Yet the memory of those frantic months refused to fade. The idea of young men braving storms and arrows to carry words across the wilderness struck a deep chord. Perhaps because it was such a fleeting moment in time, the Pony Express became more myth than mail service, an embodiment of a restless, ambitious America. Today, the trail is marked with monuments and museums, celebrated in stories, reenactments, even postage stamps. We remember the riders as knights of the frontier, charging against distance and danger. The reality was far harsher. Meager pay, relentless exhaustion, constant peril. But perhaps that is what makes the story so compelling. The Pony Express was impractical, unsustainable, and wildly romantic. It was a dream on horseback, galloping briefly across history before vanishing into legend. So the next time you complain about a package being late, remember the riders of 1860 who risked their lives to carry a handful of letters through snowstorms and deserts. Imagine the thrill of the handoff, the pounding hooves, the desperate race against time. The mail must go through, they said, and for a short, shining moment it did at the speed of a gallop. Beer, that humble golden drink you might casually crack open on a Friday evening, was once not just a beverage but civilization in a clay jar. To the ancients, beer wasn't a luxury or even a guilty pleasure. It was a staple, a form of nourishment, and sometimes a spiritual offering. In other words, it was liquid bread, drunk by everyone from kings to farmers, from Sumer to medieval Europe. If water was questionable, beer was salvation. And if the taste left something to be desired, well, no one complained too loudly. It was safer than cholera. The story begins in Mesopotamia, land of temples, irrigation canals, and writing on clay tablets. Archaeologists suspect that beer's invention was one of history's great happy accidents. Picture a forgotten bowl of grain porridge left out in the heat, exposed to airborne yeast, bubbling away into a frothy, tangy mess. The curious farmer who dared to taste it discovered not poison, but a mild euphoria and a new lease on social interaction. This bubbling gruel became the drink of the gods, or at least of people pretending to be gods after 3 bowls. By 3000 BCE, the Sumerians were already dedicated brewers. They had recipes, hymns to the goddess of beer Ninkasi, and specialized straws for drinking thick, unfiltered brews from communal jars. These weren't lagers you'd sip delicately on a patio. They were hearty, soupy concoctions full of floating grain and sediment, drunk more for calories than flavor. Think of it less as a crisp pint and more as a bready soup that happened to make you cheerful. The Egyptians, of course, perfected the mass production of beer. Laborers building the pyramids were paid partly in daily rations of bread and beer. It was sustenance, energy, and a kind of currency rolled into one. Brewing became so central to Egyptian society that breweries were attached to temples, and jars of beer were placed in tombs as offerings for the afterlife. Because, frankly, if you had to face eternity, you might prefer to do it with a few jars of your favorite brew. Brewing spread outward into Greece, where beer was considered a barbarian's drink, wine held the higher cultural rank, and into Celtic and Germanic Europe, where beer found its true home. The climate wasn't right for vineyards, but barley thrived. Villages brewed their own local variations, often flavored with herbs, honey, or whatever was lying around. The result was wildly inconsistent but always communal. Brewing was as much a household skill as baking bread. Women, in fact, were the traditional brewers in much of Europe, alewives who prepared beer for family and neighbors long before breweries became commercial enterprises. Medieval Europe took beer from rustic porridge to something closer to the drink we'd recognize today. Monasteries became the great centers of brewing, partly because monks had the time, partly because they had access to resources, and mostly because the rule of St. Benedict didn't forbid drinking, at least not entirely. Monks brought order to the chaos of brewing. They experimented with ingredients, improved methods of fermentation, and recorded recipes. And crucially, they introduced hops. Hops changed everything. Before hops, beer spoiled quickly and tasted rather flat. With hops, it lasted longer, traveled better, and gained a distinct bitterness that balanced the sweetness of malt. It was still not the sparkling beverage of modern pubs, but it was recognizable as beer. Monastic beer became a source of revenue, a draw for pilgrims, and, let's be honest, a perk of living in the cloister. Nothing cures spiritual fatigue like a pint of well-brewed ale. Of course, brewing wasn't just about taste or sustenance. It was also about safety. In a world where water was often teeming with bacteria, boiling during the brewing process made beer a far safer drink. Children drank it, pregnant women drank it, nobles and peasants drank it. Morning beer, midday beer, evening beer, each meal came with a companion pint. If everyone was mildly buzzed, no one seemed to mind. Society ran on liquid barley. The industrialization of beer came much later, with larger breweries, scientific control of yeast, and standardized recipes. But in the ancient and medieval world, every batch was a little different, every mug a surprise. Strength varied, flavor varied, quality varied. Some brews were hearty enough to replace a meal. Others were so weak they were barely more than flavored water. The point was not refinement but survival. And yet, amid all this practicality, beer was also joy. It was a reason to gather, to sing hymns or tavern songs, to celebrate victories or drown sorrows. Beer had a foot in both the sacred and the profane. The Sumerians toasted Ninkasi. Medieval villagers toasted the local lord, or more likely, toasted the fact that the harvest hadn't failed. Beer carried the weight of ritual, community, and calories in one convenient mug. So next time you see a frothy pint, remember that it carries thousands of years of history. From the accidental porridge of Sumer to the monastery cellars of medieval Europe, beer has always been more than a drink. It was a foundation of diet, a safeguard against disease, a payment for labor, and an excuse for a song. It was civilization, foaming gently at the brim. And if the ancients could step into a modern pub, they might be astonished at the clarity of the glass, the coldness of the pint, the sheer luxury of choice. But they would recognize unmistakably that same golden thread. Bread made liquid, yeast made magic, society made drinkable. If beer was the fuel of ancient civilization, then medieval Europe figured out how to build entire social engines around it. Brewing had long been a domestic craft, handled mostly by women, but as villages grew into towns and towns into bustling trade hubs, the production and sale of ale blossomed into an entire economy. And at the center of that foamy, frothy system stood the alewife, the medieval entrepreneur you never read about in history class. Alewives were everywhere in the Middle Ages. They brewed at home, often in modest kitchens with cauldrons, malted grain, and wooden vats, selling pints to neighbors, travelers, or anyone who wandered by with a coin to spare. Their ale was not bottled, it went straight into jugs, mugs, or communal pitchers. If you walked into a medieval street and followed your nose, you'd find the scent of boiling malt wafting from doorways, a clear signal that beer was being brewed inside. It was humble work, but it was work that mattered. Ale wasn't a luxury good, it was daily bread in liquid form. Men and women, nobles and servants, even children, everyone consumed it, often in startling quantity. Not because medieval people were perpetually drunk, though some certainly were, but because beer was simply safer than water. If you wanted to stay hydrated without gambling with dysentery, you turned to ale. Because of this universal demand, alewives held a curious position of power. They weren't nobles, they weren't clergy, but they provided something society literally could not live without. And yet, predictably, suspicion followed them. Alewives were sometimes accused of watering down their brews, cheating customers, or using unsavory ingredients. In towns across England and Europe, officials tested beer quality, measuring alcohol strength and volume with a suspicious eye. Fines and punishments awaited those who broke the unwritten contract. Beer must be good, or at least good enough to keep people coming back. Interestingly, the image of the alewife left a strange cultural residue. Some historians argue that certain elements of the stereotypical witch, pointed hat, bubbling cauldron, broom, trace back to alewife. The pointed hat may have been a marker of sellers at markets, the cauldron was obvious, and the broom was used to signal that fresh ale was ready for sale, placed outside the door like a signboard. Over time, suspicion of powerful, independent women who brewed beer may have bled into the darker folklore of witchcraft. So, the next time you picture a witch stirring her pot, you might also imagine her handing you a frothy mug. But beyond the homebrewing economy, beer found its grand stage in the medieval tavern. These establishments were not pubs in the modern sense. No frosted glasses, no menus of artisanal Alesh, but they were community centers, buzzing with chatter, arguments, laughter, and occasionally fistfights. Taverns served as places to eat, to play dice or cards, to discuss business deals, and to grumble about the local lord. They were the beating heart of medieval town life, where every stratum of society could, at least briefly, mingle over a shared pitcher. And taverns had reputation. Some were cozy, respectable spots where travelers could expect a meal and a bed. Others were dens of vice, noisy and smoky, where the ale flowed cheap and fast, and where you'd leave missing your purse if you weren't careful. Chroniclers of the time often lumped taverns together with brothels and gambling houses, seeing them as distractions from godly living. But for the common people, they were a welcome escape from the monotony of work, the dampness of cottages, and the weight of constant toil. Ale wasn't the only drink served. In wealthier regions, especially southern Europe, wine was also popular. But in northern Europe, beer reigned supreme. Stronger Alesh, brewed with hops, gradually gained ground, becoming the favored drink in many towns. With beer came songs, and with songs came culture. Medieval drinking songs weren't just about merriment. They were about memory, ritual, and solidarity. Shared mugs led to shared stories, and shared stories, as always, led to shared identity. Of course, the authorities kept a watchful eye. Medieval governments realized quickly that beer wasn't just a necessity. It was a taxable commodity. Regulations sprouted up around pricing, production, and quality. Too weak, and an alewife could be hauled before the courts. Too expensive, and customers would riot. Too strong, and the clergy would frown. Balancing the perfect pint was as much about politics as it was about fermentation. There's also something to be said about class. Nobles had their private cellars, filled with stronger, higher quality Alesh and imported wines. Peasants drank whatever was cheapest and freshest, often small beer, with very low alcohol content, meant to hydrate rather than intoxicate. The difference between noble and peasant beer could be as stark as the difference between bottled champagne and a supermarket box of wine. Yet, in both cases, people drank daily and in volume. A monk in the 13th century estimated that an adult might consume 3 liters of beer a day without raising eyebrows. Whether that was healthy or not, well, perhaps it explains the cheerful roundness of certain medieval portraits. And so beer became more than drink. It became culture, economy, and identity. It shaped towns, empowered women, filled taverns, and even nudged folklore in strange directions. Without beer, medieval Europe would have looked very different. Perhaps less merry, certainly more thirsty, and probably a great deal sicker. So when you imagine a medieval evening, don't picture silence and solemnity. Picture instead the smoky warmth of a tavern, mugs clinking, dice rolling on wooden tables, a half-suspicious alewife wiping her hands on her apron, and a dozen stories swirling around the room with the steam of the beer. Civilization wasn't only forged in castles and cathedrals. Sometimes it was brewed in a kitchen, poured into a jug, and drunk beneath the dim light of a tavern fire. If medieval Europe loved beer, it also knew the consequences of beer. For every cheerful tavern scene filled with clinking mugs and bawdy songs, there was a morning after, when the fire had gone out, the mug was empty, and the drinker was left staring at the rafters with a pounding head and a stomach that rejected all reasonable requests. Yes, hangovers existed long before college parties and bottomless brunches. The Middle Ages knew them well, though they had their own ways of understanding and judging the foggy haze of excess. For most medieval people, drunkenness was not treated as a minor embarrassment. It was a moral failing, a sign that you had surrendered reason to appetite. The church, of course, had plenty to say on the subject. Monastic writers cataloged drunkenness among the vices, listing it alongside gluttony, lust, and wrath. Too much drink made one forgetful of God, careless of duties, and vulnerable to sin. A single mug too many could tip you from conviviality into condemnation. In a society where salvation was always hanging in the balance, the line between enjoying your ale and falling into vice was perilously thin. And yet, despite the stern warnings, medieval sources are littered with evidence of drinking gone wrong. Take, for example, the stories of students in medieval universities who developed reputations for rowdiness, tavern crawling, and loud carousing. Towns like Paris or Oxford became infamous for drunken brawls between students and locals. Chroniclers clutched their pearls, and bishops shook their heads, but the songs and poetry written by these same students make it very clear. The hangover was a badge of honor as much as a punishment. As for remedies, medieval Europe had no shortage of imaginative cures for the morning after. Physicians recommended everything from cabbage juice to raw eels, while household wisdom advised hearty broths or strong vinegar. The ancient Greeks had already suggested cabbage as a kind of anti-drunkenness plant, and the Middle Ages dutifully carried on the tradition, though one suspects its effectiveness was less than miraculous. Some recommended drinking more of the same beverage in the morning, a strategy that modern sufferers might recognize as the hair of the dog. Others leaned on the tried and true method of suffering in silence until the body worked things out on its own. Still, the line between a hangover and divine punishment wasn't always clear. People believed that excess in drink opened the door to spiritual dangers as well as physical ones. To be drunk was to lower the defenses of the soul. Demons, some thought, hovered near taverns, waiting for their chance to slip inside through a mug of ale. A man staggering through the street at dawn wasn't just unsteady. He was, in the eyes of a moralizing observer, perilously close to damnation. But here lies the contradiction of medieval life. While sermons thundered against drunkenness, communities depended on beer. Monks brewed it, peasants lived on it, nobles toasted with it, and every so often someone went too far. It's telling that medieval literature, from bawdy tales to epic poems, often makes room for scenes of drunken foolishness. To laugh at a drunkard was to acknowledge what everyone knew. Drinking too much was inevitable in a society where beer was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. One might imagine that nobles escaped such judgments, but they too had their moment. Banquets often featured rivers of alcohol, with courses lasting hours and toasts punctuating every dish. Chroniclers describe lords collapsing from their seats, knights unable to mount their horses, even kings too inebriated to keep their crowns straight. Yet the chroniclers rarely blamed the drink itself. They blamed excess, weakness of will, or the influence of bad companions. Alcohol was never the enemy, overindulgence was. And then, of course, there was the hangover's quieter cousin, the long-term effects of heavy drinking. While medieval physicians lacked modern terminology, they observed the bloated bellies, trembling hands, and dulled minds of those who lived in the tavern rather than merely visiting it. They described men who could not function without drink, whose health decayed steadily. It wasn't science as we know it, but it was observation. Beer gave life, and beer could take it away. Interestingly, the morality of drink wasn't only about personal sin. It was also about order. A drunken town was a dangerous town. Too many ale-soaked fights could tip into riots, and authorities responded with laws regulating tavern hours, prices, and measures. Fines were levied against public drunkenness, and tavern keepers were sometimes punished for serving those already stumbling. These laws weren't always enforced with rigor, but they reflected a fear. If beer loosened tongues, it could loosen control, and no lord or bishop wanted that. Yet despite the warnings, the fines, the sermons, and the remedies, people kept drinking. Because what else was there? Water could kill you. Milk was for children or calves. Wine was expensive and reserved for those further south or further up the social ladder. Beer, with all its risks and consequences, remained the drink of choice. And so the medieval hangover persisted, written into songs, condemned from pulpits, and laughed about in taverns. It was both punishment and proof of life's pleasures, a reminder that even in an age of faith, people still stumbled out of bed, clutching their heads, wondering why on earth they had said yes to that last mug. If anything, the hangover made medieval drinkers more relatable. Strip away the centuries, the candlelight, the wooden mugs, and the smoky tavern, and what do you have? The same universal truth, humanity's endless ability to overdo a good thing, and the equally endless search for a cure that never quite works. For all its reputation as a drink for peasants and tavern brawlers, beer had a sacred side. To understand it fully, you have to think of it not only as a beverage, but as a thread woven into the very fabric of medieval life. It wasn't just something to sip after work, it was sustenance, currency, ritual, and, in some sense, prayer in liquid form. Beer was life, and life was never only about survival. It was also about meaning. Take, for instance, the monasteries. If there is any single institution that can claim credit for elevating beer above mere fuel, It is the medieval monastery. Monks brewed with the same seriousness that they copied manuscripts or rang bells for prayer. Brewing was a craft, but it was also devotion. Each cask rolled out of a cloistered brewery was part of the larger rhythm of monastic life, ora et labora, prayer and work. Brewing was work, and so, strangely enough, drinking beer became an act connected to prayer. Some monasteries became famous for their beer, exporting it beyond their cloisters and into the towns around them. The monks' reputations for discipline and care translated into trust in their brews, and for good reason. A monastic beer was often safer, stronger, and simply better than whatever a town tavern might ladle into your mug. Even today, centuries later, some of the world's most renowned beers still trace their origins back to abbeys. In this sense, sipping a beer is a direct inheritance from medieval religion. But monasteries weren't the only place where beer was linked to ritual. In households across Europe, beer accompanied every turning of the year. Harvest festivals featured mugs lifted high, prayers murmured over foaming cups, and toasts made to the health of the community. Weddings could scarcely proceed without barrels rolled into courtyard. Births were celebrated with ale. Even funerals had their share of drinking, where mourners raised their mugs not only in sorrow but in recognition of life's brevity and the promise of reunion. Beer blurred the line between the sacred and the social, between prayer and party. It's telling that many saints were said to perform miracles involving drink. Saint Bridget of Ireland, for example, was famed for turning water into beer for thirsty clerics, echoing Christ's transformation of water into wine. Beer wasn't merely tolerated by the church. In some cases, it was embraced, baptized into legend, sanctified by miracle. For a culture that saw no contradiction between holiness and hearty living, beer fitted neatly into the fold. And then there was the household. Daily life in medieval Europe often revolved around brewing, especially for women. Housewives became adept at the art of ale-making, tending their brewing pots as carefully as they tended their children. Alewives, women who brewed for sale, became fixtures of town economies, recognizable by the ale stakes or branches they hung outside their doors as advertisement. If you picture medieval daily life, you should imagine not only fields and markets but kitchens fragrant with malt and hops, cauldrons simmering, children running underfoot while mothers stirred and tasted. Of course, brewing wasn't only practical. It was also a way of keeping community ties strong. Neighbors might exchange recipes, share yeast, or lend a hand with particularly large batches. Brewing, like baking, was one of those invisible crafts that sustained the village, part of the rhythm of daily life so constant that it rarely made the chronicles, but without which life would have faltered. Beer also found its way into contracts and payments. Rent might be paid partly in ale. Workers might be rewarded with it. Lords could dispense it as largesse, and peasants could owe it as obligation. A good harvest meant more beer, which meant more chances for generosity, or more fuel for feasting. In this sense, beer was both commodity and community, both survival tool and status symbol. And what of the sacred calendar? Lent, Advent, feast days all had their own customs with regard to drink. In some monasteries, stronger liquid bread beers were brewed specifically for fasting seasons, since beer did not break the fast. Imagine, then, a monk sipping his mug of dark, nourishing ale on an otherwise empty stomach, convinced that he was keeping the rules while still being sustained. It's a loophole worthy of admiration. Holy, clever, and delicious all at once. What fascinates modern readers most, perhaps, is how normal beer was in the medieval diet. Children drank it, pregnant women drank it, priests drank it, kings drank it. There was no shame in drinking it morning, noon, and night, because beer wasn't about escape, it was about sustenance. It was water you could trust, food you could sip, and pleasure you could share. If beer happened to lift the mood or loosen the tongue, that was not a bug but a feature. Of course, beer was not the only drink of ritual significance. Wine loomed large in the South, particularly for the Eucharist. But in the colder, grain-rich North, beer served as the sacred drink of the people. If wine was the blood of Christ, beer was the breath of daily life, humble, sustaining, quietly holy in its own way. Think, too, of how beer shaped time. Brewing was a process of patience. Malt must soak, yeast must work, flavors must develop. To brew beer was to reckon with the passing of days and weeks, to watch nature do its work, to surrender to rhythms outside your control. In a society always conscious of seasons, of feast days and fasts, of bells tolling the hours, beer became yet another marker of time's flow. So when we picture a medieval villager raising his mug, we shouldn't think only of leisure or drunkenness. togetherness. We should see something far deeper, a gesture of gratitude, a moment of ritual, a thread in the great tapestry of life. Beer was nourishment, it was currency, it was religion, it was community. It was, in short, one of the most important rituals of being alive. Beer, like most things that humans love too much to keep to themselves, has always had a way of spilling beyond the household and into the marketplace. If monasteries sanctified brewing and kitchens kept it alive, the taverns gave it a stage. The tavern was more than a place to drink. It was the medieval stage for gossip, business, singing, brawling, gambling, and, occasionally, regretting. In many ways, taverns were the pulse of a town. The church bells marked the hours, but the tavern told you the mood. A bustling tavern with mugs sloshing meant prosperity. An empty one whispered of famine, plague, or war. People needed beer, yes, but they needed something else just as badly, the company of others. And taverns were where those needs met, foamed, and occasionally spilled over. Beer became a trade good, too. Barrels rolled through city gates, clattered onto carts, and crossed rivers on barges. Certain towns became famous for their brews, and their reputations spread. Just as today you might travel miles for a craft beer that people swear tastes different. Medieval drinkers knew that Hamburg, for example, brewed a particularly strong and reliable ale. Flemish cities exported beer in such quantities that their casks traveled as far as England. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was an economy. This economy had winners and losers, of course. Wealthy brewers grew rich, while smaller alewives found themselves squeezed by taxes, regulations, or outright ban. Medieval governments quickly realized that beer was not just sustenance but revenue. A penny per pint added up quickly when everyone, including children, drank it daily. Some rulers even took direct control of breweries, ensuring that the crown, not just the town, profited from every mug lifted in cheer. The tavern itself became a fixture of medieval life. But what did it look like? Forget neon signs and polished counters. A medieval tavern was dim, smoky, and fragrant with malt and sweat. The floors were often packed earth, strewn with rushes to soak up spills and worse. Benches and rough tables filled the room. A fire crackled if you were lucky, while a barrel on its side served as both furniture and stock. In the corner, dice clattered. Somewhere nearby, someone was loudly insisting that they hadn't lost. And yet, for all their roughness, taverns were strangely democratic. Kings had their banquets, monasteries had their refectories, but the tavern belonged to everyone. The poor could drink there, the middling folk could deal business there, travelers could swap news there, and occasionally even nobles would slum it for the thrill of mingling in disguise. Taverns blurred lines between classes, between business and pleasure, between order and chaos. Taverns also helped shape politics. In England, for instance, it was in taverns that political dissent often brewed alongside the ale. Plots could be whispered in corners, alliances forged over mugs. The crown understood this, which is why taverns were occasionally surveilled or licensed. To control beer was to control people. The medieval state may not have known about social media, but it knew about taverns, and it treated them with the same mixture of suspicion and necessity. Of course, taverns also shaped culture. Songs, poems, and stories often began life in their smoky air. Wandering minstrels would earn their keep performing for mugs of ale. Students, forever the rowdiest drinkers of medieval Europe, turned taverns into lecture halls of a different sort, where Latin chants gave way to raucous choruses about love, luck, and, naturally, beer. Even the medieval plays that would eventually evolve into professional theater often began in spaces not far removed from taverns. To drink beer was not only to quench your thirst, it was to sit in the beating heart of culture. Trade itself reshaped beer. As hops spread across Europe, the taste of beer changed. Early medieval Alesh were often sweet, spiced, and short-lived, but hop-bittered beer lasted longer and traveled farther. This meant breweries could think bigger. Beer could now be brewed in one city and consumed weeks later in another, changing it from a local household drink into a regional, even international commodity. The tavern drinker might not think of this when he raised his mug, but every sip carried the story of distant fields, barges, roads, and taxis. The tavern also created characters, archetypes that linger in our imaginations even today. The alewife, stout and sharp-tongued, managing her barrels and her rowdy customers. The innkeeper, counting coins with one hand and pouring with the other. The bard, strumming a lute. The gambler, forever convinced that his luck was about to turn. These figures, though half caricature, remind us that taverns were both real and mythic, places of ordinary life and of stories. Yet taverns had their dangers. Drunken brawls were common enough that medieval laws often included fines for a phrase in alehouse. Thieves found taverns excellent places to work, since loosened tongues meant loosened purses. Even morality itself was questioned in these places, with preachers railing against the sins of drink, lust, and idleness that supposedly flourished under their roof. Still, even the sternest preacher knew that beer was not going anywhere. For all their flaws, taverns provided something medieval life desperately needed: community outside the family and church. They were spaces where laughter could rise louder than bells, where strangers became friends, where loneliness could be briefly soothed. And while they may have been smoky and noisy and occasionally dangerous, they were also where Europe learned to socialize, to trade, to argue, and to sing. So the next time you picture a medieval tavern, don't just imagine the mugs of froth. Picture the life inside them, the bargaining, the storytelling, the gossip, the plotting, the laughter. Beer made the tavern possible, but the tavern made medieval society livelier, riskier, and far more human. Beer was no longer just something you brewed at home. It was something you could find on any street corner, a drink that fueled not only bodies but economies and imagination. In the tavern, beer became more than nourishment. It became culture. For as long as people have brewed beer, people have also worried about other people drinking too much of it. The story is almost embarrassingly predictable. One group discovers how to turn grain into something foamy and delightful, and another group immediately starts warning that it will rot the soul, destroy society, and leave everyone asleep in the gutter. Medieval Europe, unsurprisingly, was no different. Beer was everywhere, and that was part of the problem. It was not a rare luxury, not an occasional indulgence. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Children drank it, priests drank it, peasants drank it, kings drank it. With no reliable way to purify water, beer was not just the safer option, it was often the only option. And when the drink of necessity doubles as the drink of pleasure, the line between refreshment and excess blurs very quickly. Preachers noticed this. Sermons often thundered against drunkenness, painting it as the gateway to every other sin: gambling, fighting, lust, idleness. Drunkenness, after all, made people harder to control. A sober worker rose at dawn to till his field. A drunk worker might be found snoring in a haystack or, worse, brawling in a tavern. The church needed order, and beer could easily dissolve it. Municipal authorities noticed it, too. City councils across Europe passed regulations on taverns: what hours they could operate, what measures of beer could be sold, even how many pints a customer could purchase at once. These rules were not always enforced. Laws against drinking rarely are, but they reveal a constant anxiety, the fear that beer was not just a drink but a social threat. And yet, for every prohibition, there was a loophole. Taverns were taxed heavily, and the revenue was simply too good to pass up. The more people drank, the more money flowed into civic coffers. So city leaders lived with a contradiction, officially denouncing the dangers of drunkenness while quietly balancing their budgets with the profits of it. It's not unlike modern governments frowning at cigarettes while happily taxing them. Monasteries had their own moral dilemmas. On one hand, monks brewed some of the best beer in Europe, often for sale. On the other, monasteries had strict rules about sobriety, silence, and moderation. The solution was a kind of hair-splitting legalism. Beer was food. It nourished, it sustained, it filled the belly during long fasts. A mug of beer was, in effect, liquid bread. And if a monk had 4 or 5 mugs in an evening, well, who could say he wasn't simply hungry? Of course, there were those who leaned into excess with no shame at all. Festivals, saints' days, harvest feasts, these were excuses to drink far beyond moderation. Chronicles complain of entire towns staggering from one alehouse to another, singing loudly, falling into ditches, and waking up with regrets. Drunkenness might have been frowned upon in principle, but in practice, people found it hard to resist when the beer was flowing and the fiddles were playing. And when they overindulged, consequences followed. Drunken brawls were one of the most common forms of medieval crime, clogging up court records with endless complaints about black eyes, broken teeth, and missing purses. Marital disputes often cited excessive alehouse visiting as a cause. Even serious rebellions were sometimes traced back to tavern chatter that grew bolder with each refill. Beer did not cause every problem in medieval Europe, but it lubricated many of them. The anxiety about beer excess also created caricatures, figures that still linger in popular culture. The drunkard staggering home, mocked in morality plays and lampooned in ballads. The alewife, accused of watering down drinks or enticing men into ruin. The tavern, depicted as a den of vice where the weak-willed squandered their coin. These stereotypes exaggerated reality, but they reveal how deeply beer was woven into people's imaginations as both delight and danger. Medical writers weighed in as well. Some praised beer for its nourishing quality, especially for the working poor. Others warned that too much of it clouded the mind, bloated the body, and bred lethargy. Physicians, then as now, tried to strike a balance. Drink moderately and beer was healthful. Drink excessively and it would kill you. Naturally, most people ignored the advice. And then there were the reformers. By the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, religious reform movements called for stricter morality, tighter regulation, and often less beer. The Protestant Reformation in particular sparked renewed debates about drinking. Was it an innocent pleasure or a sinful indulgence? Should taverns be closed entirely or reformed into sober, orderly establishments? The answers varied wildly depending on who was in charge and how thirsty they happened to be. Despite all the anxiety, beer never disappeared. If anything, attempts to clamp down on it only confirmed its importance. People were willing to pay fines, risk scoldings, and endure sermons for the sake of their mugs. That resilience says something about human nature. You can frighten people about their souls, but you can't keep them from their drink. The moral panic surrounding beer, then, was less about the liquid itself and more about what it represented. It represented freedom, an hour stolen from toil, a laugh shared with friends, a night of unguarded speech. It represented danger to authority because drunk people talk, and talking people sometimes conspire. And it represented equality because in the tavern, at least for a moment, the distinctions of rank blurred under the haze of drink. So when we picture medieval people drinking beer to excess, we should remember that the scolding sermons and restrictive laws were not just about health or morality. They were about control. To regulate beer was to regulate joy, conversation, rebellion, and even hope. And for all the efforts to contain it, the beer always flowed. The moral panic faded, resurfaced, and faded again, as it always does. Every age invents its own version of the dangerous indulgence. Gin in the 18th century, absinthe in the 19th, fast food in the 20th. In the medieval world, beer carried that burden. Too much froth, too much laughter, too many bruised foreheads, and yet always another round. Beer excess, in other words, was not just a problem. It was a rhythm of medieval life, swinging between feast and fast, indulgence and repentance. People worried about it, yes, but they never stopped raising their mugs. And in that contradiction lies a very human truth. The same thing that terrifies us can also be the thing that makes life bearable. When we think of beer today, we usually think of Friday nights, not medicine cabinets. But for much of human history, beer was not only a drink of pleasure, it was also considered a cure, or at least a preventative, or at the very least, a way to convince yourself that you were healthier than you probably were. In the medieval imagination, beer was not merely food and not merely fun. It was, in its own way, medicine. To begin with, beer was seen as safe. That may not sound like much, but in an age when water could kill you faster than a sword, safe was no small thing. Rivers and wells were easily polluted by waste, and outbreaks of dysentery or typhoid were always just around the corner. Beer, by contrast, had been boiled in its brewing process, fermented, and rendered much less likely to carry the invisible horrors that medieval people couldn't name but certainly experience. Drinking beer wasn't just about taste, it was about survival. To choose beer over water was, in effect, to practice preventive health care. Medical writers took note. Beer appeared in treatises alongside herbs, tonics, and poultices. The 12th century German mystic Hildegard of Bingen, who dabbled in both theology and medicine, wrote approvingly of beer made from barley. It was warming, she said, strengthening, even stabilizing. She warned that it could also cause phlegm and indigestion if overdone, but that was true of almost anything in her view. Moderation, she implied, made beer a healthful companion. Other doctors agreed. Beer was thought to balance the humors, the bodily fluids that supposedly govern health. Too dry? Beer moistened. Too cold? Beer warmed. Too sluggish? Beer quickened the blood. Physicians even prescribed different beers for different constitutions, not unlike modern doctors recommending one diet for a patient and another for someone else. A light ale might suit someone melancholic, while a stout brew could strengthen the sanguine. It was medicine by personality type, written in froth. Beer also found its way into actual treatments. Recipes for medieval remedies sometimes included beer as a base liquid for mixing herbs. It was thought to help extract and deliver the properties of plants, making them easier to digest. If you were prescribed a concoction of sage or wormwood, it might be steeped in ale. The bitterness of hops or herbs could be masked in the malty brew, turning what might have been unbearable medicine into something at least drinkable. Think of it as the medieval version of cherry-flavored cough syrup. And then there was beer as nourishment. Thin, low-alcohol beer, what we would call small beer, was consumed by children, the sick, and nursing mothers. It was considered gentle and sustaining, almost like a liquid porridge. It contained calories, some nutrients, and enough liquid to keep the body running. When someone was too weak to eat solid food, small beer could carry them through. Monasteries, hospitals, and households all relied on this principle. Beer kept people alive, even when bread or meat ran short. At times, beer even replaced water in recipes. Stews and porridges might be made with ale, lending flavor and, supposedly, a dose of health. Bread could be soaked in beer for the infirm. Beer soup was not a joke, it was a standard dish. To the medieval mind, this was not strange. It was entirely logical. If beer was nourishing, why not use it as the base of a meal? Of course, not everyone agreed on the medical merit. Some writers worried that beer was heavy, clogging, and unrefined compared to wine, which was seen as the drink of more civilized peoples to the south. Beer, they sniffed, was for northern barbarians, and its effects were correspondingly crude. Wine was light, elevating, and sophisticated. Beer was earthy, bloating, and rough. But this was as much cultural snobbery as medical truth. Southerners drank wine because their land produced grapes. Northerners drank beer because it didn't. Each defended their own beverage as the healthier choice, and each quietly indulged in more than was strictly necessary. The practical uses of beer as a health drink went even further. Women used it in household remedies, from hair rinses to skin washes. Ale mixed with herbs could soothe rashes, ease stomach complaints, or calm a cough. It might not have cured anything in the modern medical sense, but it provided comfort, which in medicine is sometimes half the battle. And then there's the psychological side of things. Beer was relaxing, calmed nerves. It took the edge off pain, smoothed over sorrow, and dulled anxiety. In a world where formal pain relief was scarce and life was often brutal, a mug of ale might have been as close as anyone could get to therapy. Was that not, in its own way, medicinal? Monasteries again played a special role here. Their beers were often brewed with care, and they treated their own products as both sustenance and remedy. Sick monks were allowed more beer than healthy ones, on the grounds that it supported their recovery. Visitors to monastic hospitals might be offered beer as part of their treatment. The lines blurred. Was this hospitality, nourishment, or medicine? To the medieval mind, the distinctions hardly mattered. One can even imagine the conversation. A mother handing her child a mug of small beer, assuring herself it was good for growth. A doctor prescribing ale with herbs, convinced it would balance the humors. A monk explaining that another pint would strengthen the constitution. In each case, the drink was more than refreshment. It was framed as health itself. And while we may laugh at the idea of beer as medicine, there's a kernel of truth. Beer really was safer than water, really did provide calories, really did ease discomfort, and really did help deliver medicinal herbs. It was not an antibiotic, but it was not useless either. In its own way, beer kept countless people alive. What's striking is how ordinary all this seemed. Beer wasn't treated as an exotic cure or a rare indulgence. It was daily medicine, the kind you barely notice you're taking. You drank it to quench your thirst, and in doing so, you fortified your body, soothed your nerves, and followed the advice of saints, doctors, and mothers alike. It was health by habit, not health by theory. So, when you imagine medieval people tipping back their mugs, don't picture only the rowdy tavern or the drunken festival. Picture also the quiet sickroom, the tired farmer, the mother with her child, the monk with his meal. For all of them, beer was more than just a drink. It was part of the body's care, a daily ritual of survival, and, in its own foamy way, a medicine of the people. And while modern doctors would probably not prescribe a pint of ale for your cough, they might grudgingly admit this much. Compared to the water, beer really was the healthier option. Beer, for all its medical and nutritional uses, had another role that may have been even more important. It bound people together. It wasn't just liquid sustenance, it was social glue. Across medieval Europe, from smoky cottages to bustling taverns, beer was the drink that turned solitude into company, meals into feasts, and gossip into legend. If bread was the staff of life, beer was the conversation that came with it. You couldn't easily drink beer alone. Well, you could, but it wasn't the point. Beer wanted an audience. It wanted clinking mugs, a table crowded with elbows, and stories told loudly enough to drown out the creak of the door hinge. Taverns were the obvious stage. Every town, large or small, had its alehouses. They were not luxurious places. Picture low ceilings, smoky air, wooden benches worn smooth by generations of fidgeting. The smell of malt and yeast clung to everything, mingled with the sweat of travelers and the faint tang of horse outside. In the corner, a fire burned, more smoke than flame, and in the center of it all, beer. The tavern was where news traveled. If you wanted to know what was happening beyond your field or street, you went there. A traveler passing through might trade stories of distant towns for a pint. A messenger might loosen his tongue after a mug or two. Rumors, truths, and outright lies were all poured into the same tankard. The tavern was, in essence, the medieval newspaper, printed daily in froth and chatter. But beer wasn't just about information, it was about belonging. To drink with someone was to recognize them, to share a moment of trust. You might not remember every detail of the conversation, but you remembered the laughter, the warmth of the fire, the taste of the ale. Friendships were sealed over mugs more often than over contract. And feuds, too, sometimes began there, when too much beer unmoored tempers. Taverns also had their hierarchy. Not everyone drank the same beer. A wealthy merchant might order a stronger, better brewed ale, while a poor laborer had to settle for thin stuff, watery and cheap. But even so, the act of drinking together blurred lines. For a few hours, everyone sat on the same benches, under the same smoke-blackened rafters, and shared in the same ritual. Beer democratized, at least temporarily. It wasn't just taverns, though. Beer was woven into festivals, weddings, and holy days. A village feast without beer was unthinkable. Ale flowed at harvest celebrations, at May Day dances, at Christmas gatherings. In these moments, beer was less about quenching thirst and more about opening the heart. It set the rhythm for songs, loosened stiff limbs for dances, and turned cautious conversations into lively storytelling. And stories, those were the true currency of beer. One pint might bring out the tale of a neighbor's misfortune, told with a chuckle. Another might unearth the half-remembered story of a local saint or a legendary battle. Beer lubricated memory, or at least confidence. The storyteller's voice grew bolder, the details more colorful. Was it exactly true? Maybe not. But after 2 or 3 mugs, who cared? Truth was negotiable, entertainment was not. In this way, beer preserved culture. Long before printing presses, before widespread literacy, stories lived in the mouths of ordinary people. And many of those stories were told in taverns over mugs of ale. Beer didn't just quench, it kept memory alive through laughter and exaggeration, through songs and boasts. Even religion, so often the stern parent of medieval life, bent a little before beer's communal pull. Monasteries brewed not only for their own consumption but also for hospitality. A weary traveler could knock at the monastery gate and find, if not a bed, at least a mug of ale. To drink together was an act of fellowship, a reminder that hospitality was a holy duty. Beer, in this context, was charity with a frothy head. Of course, not everyone approved. Moralists and preachers warned about the dangers of the alehouse. Too much time spent there meant neglected work, wasted money, sinful behavior. Sermons thundered against drunkenness, and city officials tried, with little success, to regulate taverns. But the truth was that no law, no sermon, no threat could fully separate people from their beer. It was too central, too human. People needed a place to talk, laugh, and escape, if only for an evening. And beer was the medium that made it all possible. Think also of the smaller gathering. A family meal with beer poured into wooden cups. Neighbors sharing a jug while mending tools. Farmers resting at midday, taking a sip from a flask carried into the field. These were quieter moments, less rowdy than the tavern, but no less significant. Beer turned even simple bread and cheese into a meal worth lingering over. It also softened life's edges. Medieval existence was not gentle. Disease, toil, war, and hunger pressed hard. Beer offered, if not escape, then at least relief. A few mugs at the end of the day could make burdens easier to carry, even if only until the morning. It dulled pain, brightened company, and allowed laughter to bubble up in places where it might otherwise have withered. So, when we imagine medieval beer, we shouldn't just picture a solitary mug on a wooden table. We should picture the circle of faces around it, the hands reaching out, the voices rising, the shared warmth of bodies crowded into a room. Beer was not simply liquid, it was participation. It was being part of something larger than yourself. Perhaps that is why the tradition has endured. Modern pubs, for all their neon and polished glass, are not so different. We still gather around drinks, still trade stories, still laugh too loudly. Beer continues to serve its ancient role, the quiet architect of community. And so, medieval beer was never just about intoxication. It was about connection. Every pint carried not only barley and water, but also the possibility of friendship, the spark of a tale, the rhythm of a song. It was not just what you drank, it was what you joined. In this way, beer built not only bodies but societies. It filled bellies, yes, but it also filled silence with stories, loneliness with laughter, and ordinary days with a touch of festivity. And when you picture that smoky tavern, crowded and noisy. Remember this, it wasn't the rafters or the benches or even the fire that held it together. It was the beer. Beer was more than a drink, it was a currency. To the medieval mind, beer was wealth in liquid form, flowing from fields to taverns, from monasteries to markets, and inevitably into the tax collector's purse. Wherever beer went, money and power followed close behind. Brewing itself could be a family affair, Aluivs stirring kettles in smoky kitchens, selling their brew by the jug to neighbors. But as towns grew, so too did the stakes. Beer became an industry, and industry demanded oversight. Local lords and city councils quickly realized that wherever there was froth, there was revenue. Taxing beer was as reliable as taxing bread, sometimes more so. After all, a loaf of bread might stretch a few meals, but a mug of beer rarely lasted the evening. Regulation became the companion of taxation. Authorities dictated not only who could brew, but also how strong and how large a measure should be. Cheats and frauds, those who watered down their ale, who used dubious ingredients, who sold short measures, were punished. The public took beer seriously. Short-changing someone on their pint wasn't just bad manners, it was an affront to communal trust. Medieval law codes reflect this obsession with honest brewing. Some towns had ale tasters, officials tasked with sipping and sniffing to ensure the quality of the local product. Imagine being paid to drink beer and call it justice. Beer also played a role in trade. Grains for brewing traveled across regions, and towns built reputations on their ale. Some beers became famous beyond their borders, carried by merchants along with cloth, salt, and spices. Monasteries, too, became renowned producers, selling surplus beer to fund their charitable work and the upkeep of their cloisters. A good monastery brew was both a spiritual and an economic blessing. The politics of beer could be fierce. Who had the right to brew? Who could sell? Who collected the profit? Taverns were licensed, breweries monopolized, and disputes over beer could spill into violence. For rulers, beer offered a way to control populations, restrict the flow, raise the tax, and you not only filled your treasury but reminded people who held the power. Yet beer also resisted control. Too central to daily life, too necessary for both nutrition and festivity, it slipped through the cracks of regulation. Families brewed at home, villages produced for themselves, and no decree could entirely capture the frothy tide. Beer, like water, found its own course. Economically, it was also a stabilizer. During poor harvest, when bread grew scarce, beer softened the blow. Thin though it might be, it was still filling, still nourishing. People could endure shortages with a mug in hand more easily than with empty stomach. Beer cushioned communities against famine and made hardship just a little more bearable. So, the economics of medieval beer wasn't just about trade and tax. It was about resilience, about how people survived the unpredictable turns of climate, politics, and fortune. Beer was liquidity in every sense, an economic bloodstream that kept medieval society alive. If beer bound the body, dreams captivated the mind. In the ancient and medieval world, sleep was not a passive act. It was a doorway, and through that doorway, people believed, came messages from gods, warnings from spirits, or glimpses of the future. For kings, dreams could be political weapons. A ruler who dreamed of victory could claim divine approval for his wars. Chroniclers recorded such visions, weaving them into the official story of conquest. A dream wasn't merely personal, it was public relations. If the king saw it, the people were meant to believe it. Commoners, too, placed faith in their nighttime vision. A farmer who dreamed of a good harvest might plant more confidently. A young woman who dreamed of marriage might see it as a sign her suitor would come soon. Dreams provided guidance where daily life offered little certainty. Dream manuals circulated, collections of symbols and their supposed meanings. To dream of teeth falling out, misfortune. To dream of water, change. To dream of bread, prosperity. These books were a kind of medieval self-help, offering answers to the unanswerable. They gave shape to the chaos of the unconscious. Religion, of course, had its say. Not all dreams were to be trusted. Some came from God, others from the devil. Discernment was crucial, and priests often acted as interpreters, weighing visions against doctrine. A dream that encouraged virtue might be embraced. One that led toward sin was dismissed as diabolical trickery. Still, dreams held power. They were consulted before journeys, before battles, before major decisions. They were feared when ominous, cherished when hopeful. Dreams made the invisible world of spirits and fate tangible, shaping choices in the waking world. And so, while kings turned their dreams into propaganda and commoners into omens, all shared the sense that sleep was not silence but a conversation. The dream spoke, the dream guided, the dream warned. When people think of the Pony Express, they imagine speed, young riders thundering across endless plains, mailbags strapped tight, horses foaming with effort. It is an image carved deep into the American imagination. But the reality, as always, was both more ordinary and more extraordinary. The Express lasted only 18 months, from 1860 to 1861. In that short time, it stitched together the vast spaces between Missouri and California, carrying letters across nearly 2,000 miles in little more than a week. In an age before telegraph wires spanned the continent, that was astonishing. The riders were often teenagers, wiry and fearless. They carried little more than the mail, their revolvers, and the knowledge that if they fell, someone else would take up the ride. Horses were changed at stations every 10 to 15 miles, ensuring that speed never slackened. By day and night, in sun and storm, the Express pressed forward. Danger was constant. Harsh weather, hostile terrain, accidents, and conflicts with native tribes all threatened the journey. Riders had to be both swift and invisible, slipping through vast lands with only the trust of their mounts and the thin protection of the mail station. Yet, for all the risk, there was also a sense of romance. The Pony Express represented a promise that the scattered settlements of the West were connected, that news could flow as swiftly as the gallop of a horse. In its brief existence, it became legend. Its end came not from failure but from progress. The telegraph, stretching wire by wire across the land, rendered horses obsolete. Instant communication trumped even the fastest rider. But the image of the Express endured, a symbol of courage, endurance, and the restless drive of expansion. Legend has a way of outgrowing truth. The Pony Express, despite its short life, grew into a myth that still gallops today. In films, novels, and schoolbooks, it is portrayed as the ultimate frontier adventure. The myth lies not in its daring, that was real enough, but in its scale. People imagine the Pony Express as the backbone of communication in the West. In reality, it carried relatively little mail, mostly government dispatches and urgent business correspondence. The average settler never sent a letter by Pony Express. It was too costly. But the legend persists because it captures something deeper, the human love of speed. The Express represented the possibility of shrinking space, of making distant places feel closer. It was a forerunner of every technological leap that followed, from railroads to airplanes to the internet. It wasn't just about carrying mail. It was about carrying hope that the world could be faster, smaller, more connected. So, when we picture the Pony Express, perhaps we should see not only dust and riders, but also the gleam of imagination. It lasted less than 2 years, but in that short time it became eternal, a story of speed that still outruns the truth. We've wandered far, from medieval snacks to ancient dreams, from galloping horses to frothy mugs of beer. At first glance, these seem like scattered curiosities, but together they tell a story of what it means to be human. We snack because we crave comfort, even when survival is hard. We dream because we long for meaning, even in sleep. We gallop across wild frontiers because we refuse to be cut off from one another. We brew beer because life is harsh, and we need both nourishment and laughter. Medieval junk food, ancient dream manuals, Pony Express riders, and beer brewing monks, these are not just fragments of history. They are reflections of the same desires we carry today. To be fed, to be guided, to be connected, to belong. And perhaps that is why these stories matter. They remind us that across centuries and continents, people have always found ways to fill their stomachs, to interpret their mysteries, to bridge their distances, and to gather in fellowship. History, in this sense, is less about dates and battles than about the quiet, ordinary acts that made life bearable. So, as you drift into sleep, imagine yourself in one of those places. Maybe you're holding a fried apple turnover at a medieval fair. Maybe you're listening to a monk interpret your dream under the glow of a candle. Maybe you're on horseback, the wind in your face, carrying a letter across a dark plain. Or maybe you're in a tavern, surrounded by laughter, the taste of ale on your tongue. Wherever you find yourself, know this, you're in good company. People before you dreamed, rode, brewed, and snacked their way through the same long nights. And now, so do you.